Welcome back to another Friday episode of The Current. I'm Bo, joined with Curtis. Excited about today's episode. But first, have you heard about what's happening tomorrow in Iowa?
No. What?
So we're recording this on a Wednesday. It's going to air on a Friday. But tomorrow, there is a baseball game at the Field of Dreams.
Oh, I did know about this.
Chicago White Sox are playing the New York Yankees.
Yes.
I'm a sports fan. If you're not, I'm sorry. But that's pretty cool.
That's cool. I think I heard that they're not playing on the actual field, but it's another field.
They
built,
made
right?
one.
Yeah, because I think the actual one's too small, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, there's not enough room. But
Right.
super cool. So, obviously, we're in Iowa, and there's this kind of iconic movie set, essentially, of Field of Dreams, Kevin Costner. Is that Kevin Costner?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, Kevin Costner. You know, it's the famous one where, like, the phrase, if you build it, they will come, and, like, it has the old, like, Hall of Fame players walking through the corn.
The best line in the movie is where he goes, "Is this heaven?" And the guy goes, "No, this is Iowa."
That's right. Yes. I need to start saying that.
Oh, exactly.
Yeah.
That's like the only time I think in cinematic history that Iowa's gotten some good light. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's really cool. I mean, you could, like, they did a lottery kind of for tickets. I mean, it's going to be a very sought after thing. I can't wait to watch. I'm going to have to. Oh, I think it starts like maybe 5 o'clock tomorrow.
I didn't know.
I'm going to turn that on. I want to see.
That'll be awesome.
You know, an MLB game in a cornfield in Iowa.
I really wanted to see the Cubs there, but
I think it's the first ever Major League Baseball game in Iowa.
Yeah,
like
I think
actual
you're right.
Major League Baseball.
MLB.
I don't think there's probably never been a Major League Baseball game in Iowa before.
What if that becomes like a stadium where they start, rotating in some games every now and again?
I hope they at least play one game there every year.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah, it's kind of down by Iowa City. I forgot the actual name of the small town that it's in, but it's kind of a small town down by Iowa City somewhere.
That's right. Check that out. Gosh,
but
that's so cool.
Super cool. So by the time you're hearing this will be like a week old.
True, yeah. So go back, catch the highlights.
But it's still pretty cool. Yeah, go back and catch the highlights is right.
Exactly.
Okay, so we're in a kind of a little mini-series here about how to read the Bible. Last Friday, we talked about reading the Old Testament.
Yep.
We kind of gave some just kind of practical, helpful things. So if you missed that episode, I really want to encourage you to go back and listen to that. And before, this is kind of a good segue, before we jump in as well, if you're going to go back and listen, that's great. You can do that on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, really anywhere you get your podcast, you can find us there. But as a more important announcement, this episode is our last one that's going to be on YouTube. So heads up on that. This will be the last video ones. If you're watching us, take a good look, take a screenshot. This is going away. But yeah, we hope you still continue to listen. Any way you find your podcast, we'll be there. So we're going to continue. The podcast is continuing, just not in video form. So heads up on that. Yeah, so let's jump in. Reading the New Testament. Where do we want to start?
Gosh, where to start? Yeah, definitely want to reiterate and say if you didn't listen to that OT one, go back, listen to the Old Testament, because I'm sure a bit of what we're going to talk about today is going to build on that a little bit. But just like we did with the last episode, we really wanted to just lay out a few just helpful sort of do's and don'ts. Here's a few things that you need to keep in mind when you're reading through the New Testament. I will say that on the whole, reading the New Testament is a bit easier.
For sure.
Yep, than the Old Testament. It'll come a bit more naturally. What I think, though, sometimes is when it's less culturally crazy and weird and we feel like we got it, we can kind of get lazy and slip up and make some mistakes, and we just think, oh, I get what's going on here. I know the New Testament. But there's still some pitfalls that we can fall into as readers of the Bible and the New Testament, and so we want to just clear some of those out. So, yeah, maybe a good spot is just to go ahead and jump on into the first point. So the first thing when it comes to reading that New Testament we want to tell you is to don't forget the context. Yeah, don't forget the context. This is huge. This, goes without saying, that's for the Old Testament as well, too. But I think it's a bigger issue we sometimes find in the New Testament where we like to hone in on like a verse or a sentence or something, and we say, I like how this sounds, and we pull it out of its context, and we kind of lose some of the force and I think some of the full body of what these New Testament authors are trying to communicate when we rip out little sentences. I remember one time we were doing a preaching series on Sundays through the Bible, and I was talking about the Bible one time. And the way I put it was, imagine you had a friend who wrote you a letter about something that was really important going on in their life. They had this big experience that changed them, transformed them. They want to let them know about what's going on. You write them this whole letter communicating it, and then you read it, and you see that person next week, and they're like, hey, man, what'd you think of my letter? Did you read it? What'd you think about what I said? And I go, oh, yeah, your letter's great. Like, every day I take a different sentence, and I just, I think about it really hard and see how it fits into my life. And the guy's gonna be like, "What are you talking about? Like, I'm trying to communicate a bigger point to you in this. Did you understand?" And so sometimes we treat the Bible, especially the New Testament, like just little nuggets of here's a verse that fits, and we lose what is Paul trying to communicate in this letter? What is Jesus attempting to do in this gospel? What is Peter or James trying to say? And instead we just highlight a particular verse.
Yep. And that happens all the time. And again, like I always want to do this. A lot of times it's what churches do. It's a lot of times what people have come to understand, like this is how you do it because they see it happening on a stage or they see it, being kind of taught even in like your Sunday school days. It's like it's just one verse pulling out of context to prove one certain thing, kind of proof texting, I think is what it's called. Like just, taking one little snippet of a larger message and proving a point. Yeah. So it's a very common pitfall in reading the New Testament.
For sure. I can think of a couple examples right off the top of my head. Probably the most popular of which is, Philippians 4:13. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And so we read that and we say, hey, I can overcome whatever is going on in my life. But if we read the context, Paul's in prison, he's struggling, he doesn't know if he's going to live or if he's going to die, and he says, I've learned the secret to being content in all of my circumstances. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me.
It's more about contentment than it is overcoming.
Exactly. So in that context, we might say, I can endure. If Paul could do all things through Christ strengthen me, he would get out of prison and he'd have all the food he wants. But he's saying, no, I know how to endure when I don't have it. So good context shift.
Because God strengthens me.
Exactly.
I can endure. That's right.
I think the second most common one that I run into in the New Testament, there's a few of them, but up there would be, it's in Matthew's gospel. It's where Jesus says, with God, all things are possible. And so this, again, sounds like a nice one. I read that, and it is uplifting. It is encouraging. Yeah. And we say, look, with God, I can get the promotion at work. I can do whatever. In the context, Jesus is talking about becoming poor or being saved despite your wealth. He gives a story who says, truly, I tell you, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to inherit the kingdom. Mm-hmm. And so all the people around go, how can we bear this teaching? Jesus tells us we shouldn't have all this money. We need to, it's going to be hard to get into the kingdom if we do. How can we deal with this? Jesus, this is too tough of a teaching. And Jesus turns back and says, it is. With man, it's impossible. With God, all things are possible. And they say, who can be saved? So it's like, oh, God can maybe even save the wealthy potentially. But it's not a statement about, hey, I can do anything because with God, all things are possible.
Yeah, it's really important distinction there. Yeah,
exactly.
And, again, like I've been guilty of it sometimes as well. It's just easy to do. And again, the New Testament is a little bit easier to understand. It happens in the Old Testament too, but New Testament happens all the time. And we just got to be careful to understand the context in which things are written. And we really try to do our best here at Rhythm. When we teach on a particular passage, we always say, hey, let's grasp the context. Let's really figure out what's going on here. The surrounding text,
set
not
the
just
stage
like
a little.
one thing to prove a particular point.
Yeah. And I love that we do that. We always and I notice this in our teaching here is always trying to say, okay, what is the author trying to get at? What is Paul saying here? What is Peter attempting to communicate here? Not, oh, hey, here's a verse that feels really good for our lives. And I think part of understanding the context isn't just like, hey, I need to understand the context, how it fits this sentence in light of the paragraph. But I think one of the things I notice in my conversations about the Bible with people is just a lack of understanding about what these individual letters are. So part of it is just having the context of like Philippians, just knowing that, oh, hey, it's Paul that's writing a letter to a church that's in Philippi, and he wants to address some things to these Philippian Christians. And so when I get that context, I understand, okay, I'm reading, like we talked about last episode, I'm reading someone else's mail. Paul's talking to this group of people, not necessarily me, but how does what he's communicating to them fit in and how does it impact me today? But we have to start with the first one before we jump to the second one. And I think oftentimes we just dive right into, okay, what's the verse saying to me?
Totally. And I get, here's what I'd say too. I think sometimes certain verses pulled out of context will provide some help and comfort in specific scenarios because it communicates a truth about God, that he does care about your life, that he is loving, that he, wants to provide for you, like whatever, it's just not a good way to read the Bible as a whole. That's what we're getting at here.
Yeah.
It's like we're really trying to help you read the Bible better.
Yes.
You know, and
that's a
as long as you're not like, again, we did a whole series on this. In fact, you should go back and listen. Twisted Scriptures, I think, is maybe what the name of that series was. Yeah, you can go back. We do kind of a very thorough conversation on some of these verses, like Philippians 4:13 and Jeremiah 29:11.
Yeah,
some of the ones that are picked out, and we are kind. We say, hey, this is like your favorite verse, because it is a lot of people like they love Philippians 4:13, and it's like their life verse.
Yeah, you got it tattooed on.
You know, I mean, it is great. I think you can accomplish things in life with God's help, not because He necessarily wants to help you more than someone else, or He wants you to win a game, but because He genuinely cares about your life. And like, that's the main truth. Like, that is, again, if that's what you're reminding yourself of, is that God cares about you, and like God wants, you know, like you to be cared for, and He's walking with you and He's for you, then go for it. But you can't read the Bible by just picking out verses.
Yeah.
The context is really, really important.
Absolutely. You make a really good point. That can we be edified by this kind of reading? Yeah, absolutely. God meets us where we're at. There are times where I read this passage, and maybe it's been out of context, but it communicates something that is ultimately true. Or, you know, the way I put it is like a broken clock's right twice a day. Like, you might get it and read from that, good. And it's like, yeah, overall, what you're taking from it is still true. Maybe it's not what it's saying there, but it's still something that's good and true. So try and understand that, we're trying to give you maybe a better way to read the Bible. There's still fruit to be gleaned. Another way I talk about the Bible oftentimes is like, if you think about it like a tennis racket, like, what is it? How is it supposed to be used? And I think we should ask the same question about the Bible. What is this? How should I use it? With a tennis racket, like, you could use it as a cheese grater. Like, it'll get it done. Like, you'll grate the cheese, but you'll find that it works so much better when you use it as a tennis racket, and you're like, oh, okay. You can grate a little cheese. You can, get some things as you pick and pull from the Bible, absolutely. But my goodness, if you use it as a tennis racket, you start to use it how it's intended, you get the context, you read it, I think you begin to get more fruit. It's sometimes tougher work, absolutely, but I think you reap better rewards from doing so.
Yeah, amen. That's so good. So yeah, the context is really, really important. But the next thing I would say, and again, if you're taking notes, I would really encourage you to write this stuff down. The context, don't forget the context, but then also don't forget the culture. There's a lot of things written in the New Testament that people just hold to as like, this is true for all time, because it was written in the New Testament. Paul says this.
Yeah.
It's a universal truth across all cultures and across all time. And that's just not, again, a healthy way to read the New Testament. You have to remember the culture in which they are in. A great example of this, slavery.
Sure.
There's a lot of different passages that talk about how you should treat slaves, and like really just kind of saying it's okay, like as long as we're treating them with respect. Like, slavery's cool. Like, owning people, like, you can make a case for slavery using the New Testament.
Right.
I think, maybe not slavery like we've seen in throughout history, but anyway, it talks about slavery. Another great example, women. There's a cultural context in which Paul speaks about this, but he talks about how women should not teach. And again, I would make an argument that's a very cultural statement because of what was happening in their culture. We have to remember the culture. And I would say, I don't think Paul necessarily in his heart was like, had a deep hatred for women and like didn't want to see them, ever like advance. And like, I mean, who knows? But I will say, like, he was probably a product of his culture in which women were viewed as less than. They didn't have very many rights. They weren't educated. And so for him to make statements, writing in the scriptures about women should remain silent and things like that, it is a cultural statement. And I feel like it's really important to remember. Those are just a couple examples, but let's have the conversation about culture as a whole. I maybe jumped the gun a little bit there, but I'm just like, but those are just things, like two just examples I thought of, like, we have to remember the culture in which this was written.
Yeah, and I think, this sort of ties into to the first thing of like, hey, remember the context, understand what's going on. Like, when we're reading Paul, say in 1 Timothy, speak about women in positions of authority, like, again, not only do we have to understand the culture that wrapped up Paul, what's going on in this time, but then also understand the context and saying, well, hold on. Paul is not penning a letter to every Christian everywhere at all times.
That's right.
That's not what he's trying to do.
Yeah.
He's speaking to Timothy, who is a church leader located in Ephesus, who's facing some particular things. So we have to ask the question, is Paul grounding this argument in some everywhere at all times, places, or is he giving specific advice to Timothy in this situation given the parameters that are going on? And you can make a great argument that in Ephesus we have, the Temple of Diana as being the worship, and that it was women who were the leaders and sort of the authoritarians in that particular cult. And so we can see some of that maybe reflecting and bringing itself into the church at Ephesus. And so Paul is kind of, hey, you need to step back. We need to make sure they're not kind of taking over and doing this. Also partially wondering about their level of education. What is it looking like there? So we have to ask the why behind Paul's imperative. Is it just cause? Is it because God doesn't want women to? Or is it because there's other stuff going on? And we can argue, we can talk back and forth, but the biggest thing is to remember, we're having to ask ourselves some culturally conditioned questions too. Another great example of this is Paul says very clearly in Timothy that women shouldn't be adorned with much jewelry or have braided hair. I see lots of braided hair in church. I see lots of jewelry going on in church.
That's right.
Now, there are some Christians, like the Apostolic Church, that will sometimes say, they'll take it very far. You can't have wedding rings, you have wedding watches, because the Bible prohibits it. But I think most Christians understand and agree, hey, some of what we're reading in this text is culturally conditioned, and maybe it has some implications for us today, but it's not the same ones. In 1 Corinthians, Paul is talking about head coverings in worship with women. I have not seen a head covering in many churches ever. And we understand, hey, there's something else going on. And I think the point Paul is trying to make is hey, in that culture, in that context, to be not have your head covered would be a bit of a shock and a scandal to the people around. And so Paul's like, hey, just kind of chill out. I think a modern day application might be don't come to church in your swimsuit.
Yeah.
Might be a bit distracting in the garb you're choosing to wear and how it's experienced by the people around you. So, again, culturally conditioned, we need to understand what's going on in that broader culture. We can't just be oh, hey, the text says it. That's what's going on.
And I want to emphasize, again, I said this in the last episode, what we are trying to provide you is a consistent approach to reading the Scripture. Because I've had conversations, in fact, within the last couple years, there was a pretty prominent, almost an employee, but a volunteer who was essentially paid, who kind of left our church on one of these particular issues.
Right.
And one of the conversations I had, he, was saying in the whole context and the culture, because you mentioned 1 Corinthians, he talks about women and,
Head
and it does mention jewelry and head coverings and braiding hair.
Yep.
In the same passage, literally right after or right before, I can't remember which way. And again, his argument was, well, that's cultural. This one's not. And again, all we're trying to do is provide you a framework where you don't have to play that game. How can you say in a passage that one thing's culture and one thing's not? That is very hard to do. And again, if you're willing to say that, then kudos to you. I respect you. I could not disagree more. Maybe you should reconsider how you're reading the Scriptures. Maybe you should reconsider about maybe what is cultural as a whole and what is not. Again, their culture was very different than ours today. And so we want to provide the best framework possible to be consistent Bible readers.
Yeah.
And we don't want to play the game. We mentioned this in the Old Testament. I don't want to play the game with what's true and what's not, or, how can we provide a framework where it's very consistent across the board and saying, okay, there might be something bigger going on here. There might be something, a broader cultural context that I need to consider.
Yeah.
Things like that. So.
Yeah, and I think that's just, not only is that good Bible reading, that's just good book reading in general. A lot of these are going to apply and say, hey, we need to understand the context. We need to understand it as a product of its time as well. That's not, and this gets difficult because on the one hand, yes, as we're reading the Bible, it is culturally conditioned. There are humans that are a part of it, and we want to say at the same time that God is somehow a part of work of this book. I think what happens oftentimes is we tip the scales a little too far on the God side, where it's kind of untouched from humanity and its current condition and their thoughts and their ideas, and God just, again, slipped them into a trance and they started to write. I don't think that's it. And we shouldn't be afraid of this tension of the divine and the human commingling.
Yeah,
We have this in the person of Jesus, absolutely.
Right.
We want to say, hey, yes, no, this is truly a human person. This is truly divine.
Yeah.
And I think we need to wrestle with some of that in the Bible, too. For too long, we thought it just kind of floated itself around. And I want to say, no, it has a history, it has a context, it has a cultural conditioning, too.
That's right.
And so we want to read it like any other good piece of literature, and that is taking that into account.
For sure. And you mentioned Jesus, that being reflected in Jesus. And this is kind of our last point in reading the New Testament is don't forget Jesus. I would say don't forget the centrality of Jesus.
Yeah.
Don't forget the weight of Jesus.
Yeah.
There's a lot of ways we can take this, but really the emphasis here is Jesus is the direct revelation of who God is.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus is the Word.
Yes.
Jesus is above the Scriptures. So as we read the Bible, an often mistake we make is we tend to elevate the Scriptures even above Jesus himself. And that is a huge and massive mistake because you're idolizing and worshiping a book rather than the one the book's about. And that is it's a mistake that I grew up in church hearing all the time. We would hold up our Bibles and churches still do this today. And it becomes I think subconsciously, I think if you ask them about it, they'd be like, oh no, we don't worship the Bible. No. But in everything in their practice and the way they teach and everything they're communicating and everything that they're doing as a church or Christian organization, whatever it may be, they're elevating the Scriptures even above Jesus. And so we really try hard to be intentional about not making that mistake. And I would encourage you to do the same. And there's a lot of kind of practical, we can kind of expand on that more. I just want to start out by saying, don't forget about Jesus.
Yes, and I think, what and this is true of the Old Testament too. Like at the end of the day, we're looking at these different texts and we want to keep them, we want to understand them in light of the broader context of the story. But then the sort of the main point of this story is the person of Jesus. I think of Jesus' interactions with the Pharisees themselves and saying like, hey, you search the Scriptures thinking it's that you're going to find life, but they're that which bear witness to me. Right. The Bible is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. And the Bible's, most important function is to help us to understand and engage in relationship with the person of Jesus. Luther, says the Bible is the manger, which contains Christ in it. That's what we're going to. That's what we're trying to find. This is very common in the kind of patristic era too, in the first few centuries, like just sort of this ruthless Jesus centrality. Now, sometimes people will accuse me and be like, oh, you're elevating certain parts, and what about this part of the Bible? And, oh, you have a canon within a canon. But I don't think that's a problem. I think we all do. We all understand that there's an Old Testament and a New Testament, and that in Hebrews, the author talks about how, the old is now obsolete, the new is somehow better. There's sort of a greater level of authority we give to that. But then I want to take that circle and tighten it even more. Like, sure, the New Testament supersedes the Old, but then Jesus supersedes everything we find in the New Testament as well. He's the direct revelation, like you said. He's the white-hot, flaming circle. So ultimately, if our reading of the Old Testament, if our reading of the New Testament just doesn't bring us to and have a better understanding of the person of Jesus, we're not getting what we're supposed to be getting from it.
That's right. And even within the New Testament, there are parts like we've been going through on Sundays a series going through the Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah.
And I would argue it's the Kingdom Manifesto.
There you go. Yeah.
It's the grandiose document. It's like the teaching of all teachings. It's it. You read, I almost would say like the church would be a lot better if we just continue to read the Sermon on the Mount over and over and over again. But I know that's not, I'm not saying we're going to do that, but in some sense it would do us a lot of good because it is the heart, the key. Like Jesus is communicating what Christian life is all about, what it looks like being a part of a different kingdom and being a part of his way.
I love in the Eastern Orthodox Church, they have a tradition where like in part of their liturgy as they're bringing out the Bible and stuff, they bring out a separate book that has just the Gospels in it. And it's sort of like specifically venerated. Yeah. And I think that's an important thing to say like, hey, no, there's something unique about this. The red letters hasn't been around for that long, but I think we're getting behind something. Like, why is it that we decide to take these particular letters and put them in red? Why do we want to emphasize them specifically?
That's right.
If not to say, hey, maybe this is extra important, perhaps, again, not that Paul's bad. We need Paul. We need to hear him. He gives us a peace and a better understanding of the Jesus story in a lot of ways, but like, at the end of the day, Jesus is the person we're going to. That's what it's all about.
That's right. And it's really cool because I have conversations with people that aren't Christians all the time, and I tell them I'm not a Christian because the Bible tells me so. I'm not even a Christian because of the Bible. And
right.
Because a lot of people's issues with Christianity is like the Bible.
Yeah.
And like I get that. I totally understand that.
Yep.
But I will tell you, I'm not a Christian because of the Bible. I'm a Christian because I literally believe in history there's an event that happened where Jesus Christ rose from the dead. And this book is a testament to that. There's eyewitness accounts to that.
Mm-hmm.
We cannot forget about Jesus in all of it. I mean, again, the scriptures are important. I don't want to give the impression like I'm just going to throw away the Bible. And, I teach from it every Sunday. And I'm proud to teach from it every Sunday.
Yep.
I think it's useful. I think it's helpful, just as it says in like 1 Timothy 3:16. Like, hey, it's useful for all of these things. But I'm not a Christian because of the Bible. And if I were, people could a lot smarter than me, could pick it apart all day long and tell me how it's wrong. And
Yeah.
I'll say, okay, cool. Like, you're right. Maybe it's got some things in it that don't make sense. Like, okay, like,
Yeah.
sure, like, I'll give you that. But that's not why I believe. That's
Yeah.
not why
Yeah.
I'm a Christian. That's not why I've decided to follow Jesus. I follow Jesus because there's an event in history that I believe is true. You know, and I think this book speaks to that. And it's an
Yeah.
eyewitness account to that. And there's people in history that put their hands on his scars. There's people that saw him
Yeah.
being raised from the dead. And like, and again, there's more evidence behind that too. But
Absolutely.
it all gets to that just main idea of just not forgetting about Jesus and really what he does for our faith more than the scriptures.
Yeah,
do.
I think that's great. Not even to say, hey, remember Jesus just as we're looking about the Bible story, but just remember Jesus in comparison to the Bible is a really important thing too. And I think that when it comes to our Bible reading, sometimes what we do is, we take Jesus and we say that's great, but I believe in Jesus because of the Bible, like you said. And I think we do that absolutely backwards. And it creates, I think I said this in the first episode, just a lot of pressure. The stakes are very high. It's too big to fail. We can't cede any ground of, literal truth in the Bible because everything unravels with it. And I think we could save a lot of young Christians and new Christians a lot of stress and worry. I think of all the people going into,
Amen.
college settings, and,
Yeah.
and they're having to fear the next word of their professor who's showing some historical inconsistencies in the Old Testament, or they're fearing every dig of the archaeologist's spade to maybe find something to discredit it. And that's just so stressful, and we can do ourselves a lot of favor by saying, what the cornerstone of my faith, to use, I guess, the Bible's language itself, isn't the Bible.
Yeah.
It's Jesus. And to go and say, hey, I have good reasons for believing this Jesus existed. I have good reasons for believing that, this Jesus was who he said he was, that the resurrection occurred. And because Jesus comes to look to the Old Testament for inspiration and authority, I do too. There's something special about this.
Yeah.
I even think of like 1 Corinthians, Paul's talking about Jesus, and he says, look, hey, some of these people are still alive and witness. Like you saw him, there was this many. Go talk to him. Paul wasn't like, hey, the Bible talked about the Messiah, believe it. No, he's like, go talk to some people. There, this thing happened. So,
That's right.
keeping Jesus, remembering Jesus is important in a variety of ways.
Amen. It's good stuff, man.
Yeah.
I love it. So as you're reading the New Testament, don't forget context, don't forget culture, and don't forget Jesus.
Don't forget Jesus.
Yeah. Don't forget Jesus.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks for all the insight today.
Yeah.
Always appreciate you, Curtis. Thanks for joining us again for another episode of The Current. And don't forget, last episode on YouTube right now. So join with us again. You have to listen to audio, but we'd love to have you back here next Friday, right here on The Current, Real Talk on Real Topics. We'll see you then. Grace and peace.